to talk about the fact that writing in English, you've got multiple audiences. You have both an Arab audience that's reading in English or reading in the book in translation, and you also have an international audience, an Anglophone audience, etc. So in writing the book, I'm walking a line between trying to play for laughs or play for recognition in a Palestinian audience. So there's a lot of kind of playing on tropes of Palestinian literature and Palestinian history, and also to make it welcoming and accessible to a foreign audience. And that is part of it. It's a book about a play. It's a book about performance. It's a book about projecting images, about telling narratives, the Palestinian narrative. So it's engaging with all those questions simultaneously. So that's something very present in my mind in the writing of such a book, and that's part of the theme, I guess, in choosing to write about the production of a play in Palestine. I was interested in theatre in Palestine for quite a long time. That interest started when I saw a film called Anna's Children when I was younger, when I was a teenager, made by a theatre practitioner called Giuliano Merchamis, which he made about his mother, who had started a theatre school for children in Jenin refugee camp. And he subsequently turned this into a theatre school called a theatre called the Freedom Theatre. And a lot of the way he talked about that theatre was about it being part of the kind of a cultural intifada, so sort of part of cultural resistance to Israeli oppression. So I was interested in that history, and also in what theatre as an art form might offer in a regime that's very much about the control of bodies in space. It's an art form that's about crowds, it's about bodies in space. And I felt like there was something I could explore there formally and kind of politically as well.
Well, there was, I believe, in 2012, a German director who put on an Arabic language performance of Hamlet in the West Bank. Was this some kind of inspiration to you? Did you use that as any kind of source material?
Yeah, that was Thomas Ostermeyer. I actually found out about that production afterwards, although I think it was quite a hit. That was in Ramallah. And there was soil on the stage, or there's a quite famous version of Hamlet that he did, and he brought it to Palestine. Actually, the Hamlet idea came kind of late. I thought I might do Macbeth when I was thinking about Shakespeare. I thought Shakespeare's everybody knows a bit of Shakespeare, even if it's kind of basic knowledge. And I thought I'd Palestinianize Macbeth if I was going to do Shakespeare. But then I found out that Hamlet had been banned in the Israeli prisons during the first Intifada because to be or not to be was seen as a call to arms. And then I discovered this whole other Arabic tradition of Hamlet, particularly in Egypt. So it felt like it was sort of fertile in these other ways. I could tap into these other resonances. But yeah, so I learned about the Thomas Ostermeyer production kind of late.
Oh, okay. And let's start with some character overviews, in particular, the protagonist, Sonia. The novel opens with her entering Israel, somewhat ghost-like. Like she's a character who lives between identities and between worlds, which is a theme that I think you explored in your previous novel, The Parisian. And I had to laugh as I was reading the opening of your book because I have been to Israel. And I actually ended up writing about this in my most recent book, but I went there to do book research nominally. It was kind of a boondoggle. And I was writing at the time what I thought was a novel about a man who's like down on his luck and tries to sell one of his kidneys to a stranger in Israel. And I'm a rube. Like I am, I guess, Catholic by birth. I'm like a big European mutt, and had very little knowledge of Israel. I was kind of going over there to learn about it because I thought I was going to write about it. I needed to see it. So I naively went to the airport and I'm standing in line at the El Al check-in, which is the most robust security check-in it has to be in the world of airlines. And suddenly I'm being interviewed by these people and they're like, who are you? What are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I'm just a novelist. I'm going over for research. They're like, what's your novel about? I'm like, oh, it's about a guy who sells one of his kidneys for $300,000. They're like, come with me. So next thing I know, I'm like, they're, going through my suitcase, the whole thing. So I related to that in a personal way is the point. I did not anticipate it being that robust, but it certainly is.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Palestinians get a sort of, special treatment at border crossings, if you put it kind of euphemistically. And I've always thought that actually that in itself is quite theatrical and performative, the way the border guards treat you. It's always struck me as theatre. I've always found that helpful in crossing the border, to be like, this is just theatre. They're just performing to intimidate you and to make you not want to come back, because that's part of the mechanism there when Palestinians who don't have and even Palestinians who do have actually a West Bank ID or an Israeli passport still get this treatment, and it's it's kind of psychological warfare a lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, in addition to the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians and the pressures brought to bear by the Israeli security forces, there are also, as you depict really well in your novel, a lot of internal divisions and tensions within the Palestinian community. And you refer to, for example, like there's the 48ers. Is that right? 48?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's the 48ers, and then there's the West Bank Palestinians. For listeners who might not have context, could you just give like a brief description of what that means?
Absolutely. So 48 is a way Palestinians, usually speaking in Arabic, will refer to the territory that was taken in 1948 in the war, and then was created the state of Israel. Although then, obviously, Israel's never actually declared its borders, so oftentimes they also consider the West Bank as part of the state. So that's a kind of a question mark around that, but that's what the kind of within the Green Line, basically, that territory is called 48. And those Palestinians who managed to stay on that land, obviously the 700,000 Palestinians were made to refugees between 47 and 49. They stayed and became citizens of the state, so they have Israeli citizenship. So this gives them a particular status with regard to Palestinians in the occupied territories, and as well as Palestinians in Jerusalem, actually. So Palestinians are they all have different legal statuses, different paperwork, different levels of freedom of movement. So part of the book I was trying to, it's almost like a sort of fantasy to put on a play with all of these elements from Palestinian society, including the diaspora, although I didn't include Gaza, although I kind of referenced the absence of Gaza in the production, because it wouldn't be really realistic to have somebody from Gaza in a play if I wanted it within the boundaries of historical Palestine. As a kind of...
Wait, may I interrupt you?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that travel between Gaza and the West Bank is that why? You would not have somebody from Gaza in the play?
No, basically, Gaza and Palestinians are stuck in Gaza. If they manage to get a visa or kind of approval, which is rare and very, very difficult to get hold of, to get out of Gaza, they will go to Jerusalem, to embassies, for example. But more or less, Gazans are stuck in Gaza. Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of the way in which the Israeli regime functions is through a kind of divide and conquer of the Palestinian population. So there's a way in which, the play is a kind of fantasy of unity in that way, in the cultural sphere.
And may I ask a perhaps like naive question about the 48ers or the Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship and Israeli passports? Are they able to vote and participate? They are. Okay. Because like I think when it comes to the issue of Palestinian statehood and like trying to work towards some sort of enduring resolution to this conflict, which has been going on our entire lifetimes and preceding our lifetimes, it seems like statehood has to be the thing, at least from my very limited perspective. And I guess that the fact that there are these 48ers, what you said, 700,000 people who live within...
700,000 became, or over 700,000 became refugees in 1948. So the remainder... which is, I can't remember the percentage, but it's quite a small percentage. So they do have the vote, but they're not a very big voting body within. They're kind of a pretty small minority, and a lot of them actually boycott voting because the system is the cards are so stacked against them that it doesn't make that much of a difference.
Okay. So Sonia Nasir, our protagonist, she's from London. She is an actress, kind of like a mid-tier stage actress, successful, but not like a wildly famous British actress. and she is coming to Haifa to stay with her sister in the wake of a breakup with her director, Harold, in one of her recent productions. I believe it's The Seagull. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so she enters the country as a kind of person between identities, right? She's part of the diaspora. She has not been back to Haifa since 2000, which I believe marks the Second Intifada.
Yeah.
And the Second Intifada is, can you just quickly describe that for people who might be like, what is the Second Intifada?
Well, the first Intifada started in the end of 1987 and was the kind of largest grassroots uprising by Palestinians against the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, largely, and it ended with the Oslo Accords in the 90s, which promised the future creation of a Palestinian state, which has not materialized. The Second Intifada was basically a second prolonged period of violence, which was triggered when Ariel Sharon entered Al-Aqsa Mosque, and yeah, I mean, I think that's a kind of moment of despair about the prospect of the Oslo Accords bearing fruits, which a lot of people were hopeful about in the early 90s, and this is sort of a turning point about a kind of loss of optimism, I suppose. Even though there were some people like Edward Said who, even at the beginning, were like, Oslo is not going to work. This is a handshake between power and the powerless.
So Sonia returns to Haifa many years after the Second Intifada, and she stays with her sister Hanin, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I just had a moment where I was like, that was her name, correct? Yeah. And so she stays with her sister, and like this novel works on so many different levels. You have Sonia's story on a personal level, her kind of mid-tier career as an actress. She's reeling from her breakup with Harold. She's reeling from a divorce with her husband, Marco, which preceded Harold. She had a very difficult miscarriage and is kind of reeling from that as well. And then she's returning to this place that occupies, I think, such a large part of her identity and her memory, and yet which I think she feels disconnected from, a bit intentionally, perhaps, but also just as a function of being part of the diaspora and living a kind of separate life. And then there's the generational shift, like the home that her grandparents lived in, which she would visit in summers as a child, has been sold to an Israeli buyer. And that's a very stark, symbolic shift. Like I think for anybody, when your childhood home or a place that is very important to you as a child changes hands and is no longer part of your family, that can be tough.
Yeah.
So that's I don't know, that the symbolism of that seems to represent maybe a larger sentiment that is pervasive.
Yeah, I mean, the Palestinian houses are so important, the kind of the symbolism of the house. There's also a famous novella, which the book kind of riffs on, called Returning to Haifa by a writer and revolutionary called Ghassan Kanafani, which is about a couple who return to their house in Haifa after the 1967 war. So suddenly there's freedom of movement between the West Bank and Jerusalem and the north. But in that kind of ends on a sort of optimistic note about the future. So there's a sort of riff on that, in that Sonia is returning to Haifa, but there's not so much optimism at the beginning, and going back to the house, which has been rather than being lost in the Nakba of 1948, has been sold subsequently. So I sort of was trying to play with those tropes there in that way. But Sonia is an ambivalent person. I think that's where she begins is in a state of ambivalence, and that ambivalence is in part produced by family dynamics. Her sister is kind of the opposite of her. Her sister's actually considers herself pretty politically committed from a young age, and they diverge on that point. Sonia kind of just doesn't want anything to do with it. She recoils from the violence, And she's like, I have my life in London. This is nothing to me. So she's returning to Haifa and returning the kind of reckoning with that, with her family history and with her role in the place.
Well, it's interesting too that she has this kind of defiance about her, at least at the outset, where she's like, I'm on holiday. She like carries that beach towel around, and she sort of just wants to be on holiday and to escape from the breakup and the sort of emotional tumult associated with what she left behind in London. And there's a line where she says, escape was never really an escape. That was the problem. You only stumbled from one thing into another. And so she comes back to Haifa to stay with her sister, and there are all sorts of things waiting for her. You never,
Absolutely.
I think it's a very common human error to think that if you change your location, you're going to change your situation internally, right?
Totally. But she's also coming, she also has these expectations of her sister, that her sister's going to mother her and look after her. This kind of, much of the novel is tracking their relationship and the expectations they have of each other and their failure to communicate. And that is, in a way, one of the beating hearts of the book is that sister relationship, which is a kind of maternal relationship in a way.
Totally. And there's also, there's great flashback sequences into childhood when Sonia was spending time in Haifa more regularly and had, I think, a more immediate and regular connection to the place. And I think maybe one of the most moving, if not the most moving passage in the entire book for me was when she goes to the West Bank, I believe as a teenager, and visits this young man named Rashid, who has been on hunger strike. Like, that sequence in the book feels like it's at the heart, because it's an undeniable connection for her. She who wishes, I think, in some ways to deny her past and her connection to this place, she can't deny that. Like, that boy sort of haunts her dreams and
Absolutely.
plays a role in her political awakening.
Yeah, it kind of at a delay he does, right? I mean, it's a pivotal moment for the sisters in the sense that Haneen, that moment is central to her narrative of commitment. How a political awakening that is kind of focuses her on the issue of Palestine, whereas Sonia, after looking at this boy and having a kind of wordless connection to him, being very confused at the age of 16, she leaves the West Bank and says, I never want to go back there again. And she doesn't ask about him later. So the story, he's kind of one of the ghosts of the book, or maybe the most important ghost in the relationship between the sisters, the sort of what happened to Rashid.
So in terms of context and the backdrop for this story, I believe that you set it against a real life event, the 2017 shooting of 2 Israeli police officers in, the Noble Sanctuary. I think it's called the Noble Sanctuary by Muslims, and the Temple Mount by Jewish people. So that's sort of the tinderbox, right? The political event, or the source of great tension.
Yes, I mean that's one event in a sequence of events. Prior to that, I mean, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the compound has been a central node in the question of sovereignty in Jerusalem. So East Jerusalem is obviously by international law illegally occupied since 1967. And Al-Aqsa Mosque and the mosque compound, just prior to that shooting, the Israeli, I think it was the police, had gone in with some settlers. There's always this question about who has control of the mosque and that area. So obviously this gives the optic, which I think that is always challenging for Palestinians, that it's primarily a question of religion rather than a question of land. And obviously it is about sovereignty and land primarily, and obviously religion is very important there as well. But that's why it was important for me to show in the protests around the imposition by the Israelis of security gates around the mosque compound, which is technically a violation of the so-called status quo of holy sites, that these 2 Christian sisters also participate in this demonstration, spectacular demonstration, actually, because it's not simply a question for Muslims. But I guess, I'd started writing the book just after that summer, and I knew I wanted the book to feature a scene of a spectacular demonstration, because the book is all about spectacle in a way. That was very important. And then I was like, oh, well, of course, the summer I started writing it, there was this very spectacular demonstration where people were praying in the streets of Jerusalem, refusing to pass through these security gates. And it was a very moving period of time to see that happening. And people were flooding down there to join these demonstrations. So it seemed sort of natural to include it in a way. And it becomes an important moment for Sonia herself, where she, being somebody who's very self-conscious about being an actor and her role that she's playing, or different roles that she's playing. In this case, she's relieved of that pressure of being an individual. She just participates in something bigger than herself, and that's kind of transformative in a moment, or it puts her in touch with something that she hasn't been in touch with so far in her life.
So I read in the acknowledgments, I believe, that you were thanking people who work in the theater who served in a kind of advisory role. So I think that means you do not have a background as a stage actress. But I wonder if you do. Do you have any background working in theater or acting on the stage?
I've been in some plays at uni, so I knew what it was like to be on a stage and learn your lines and stuff, the kind of basic knowledge of the mechanics or the rehearsal process. But that was about it. I mean, I do think that, we are very familiar. We watch movies and we see plays. We're familiar with actors and with acting as an art form. So it's sort of a familiar mode in a way. But I did do research, obviously, specifically speaking to practitioners of theatre in Palestine, but also generally to actors, trying to check that things were realistic or not, or
Were you a good actress?
I think I was okay. I don't know.
If you would like to do a monologue, I open the floor to you now, if you would like to.
No, thanks.
So the structure of this novel, like a great structuring device, has to do with this staging of Hamlet, and sort of takes us through the fundamental steps in a theatrical production, right? I mean, is that accurate? That's the way it read to me.
Yeah, basically the play becomes the thing. Sort of the plot starts to revolve around this production, the kind of obstacles the cast face, the difficulties of rehearsing, the set getting dismantled and so forth, trying to get the protagonist of the play, the guy playing Hamlet, who's a pop star who has no acting experience, to learn how to act. This is the drama of the book.
His name's Wael. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Wael, yeah. Okay. So this story has so much to do with art and its context. And there's something funny to me. I mean, there's a lot of humor in this, like the back and forth between the various actors, the absurd lengths that they have to go to just to get to rehearsal. It's also something sad about it. Like that's the thing about this story, about this place, and the forces that are acting upon these people. It gets complicated, like emotionally. Like, you can't always live in darkness. I think anybody who lives long enough comes to realize this. Like, even when really dark stuff is happening, you can't always be operating at that frequency, right? There have to be moments of levity, and there are. And then there are these moments of transcendent beauty and camaraderie. And your book does a really nice job of capturing all that. And I think a lot about, I had to think a lot about the play Hamlet and its particular resonances for Palestinian people. And I'm going to go back to this German theater director, Thomas Ostermeyer, who staged an Arabic language performance of Hamlet, as we discussed, in the West Bank, and something that he said about it that resonated with me. And he was talking about how Hamlet is about a political subversive weighing whether or not to violently oppose a corrupt and unlawful government. That's one of the things that it's about. And this director, Ostermeyer, says, quote, "For Palestinians, this aspect of the play was unmistakable. Performing this as we did in Ramallah, a play which starts asking the question whether you should take up your weapons and resist. You're publicly voicing a question that 80% of your audience, and especially the young ones, are negotiating on a daily basis. So despite the fact that, historically and culturally, Hamlet is obviously far removed from the West Bank, it speaks across time and across place in a way that's
Totally.
really, really poignant.
Yeah, he's ambivalent. He's uncertain, Hamlet. He spends much of the play kind of dithering or anxious about the act. And there's a sort of pun on act that the novel is also negotiating. Whether to act or to act, and whether those two things can be the same. It's not in Arabic that there's no pun, but in English there is. So the book does pivot on that, absolutely. And the question of ghosts as well. I think the ghosts of the previous generation exhorting the young to follow, to avenge them, I suppose, or to follow in their footsteps. Definitely something that's also there, as well as the other resonances of mother relationships and father relationships that I also was playing with. But yeah, and it made it kind of fertile to play around with, and to almost to joke around with, because the cast are discussing, how direct an allegory it should be of the Palestinian case. And Mariam, the director, doesn't want it to be so direct. She says, no, it can be ambiguous. We shouldn't make it so obvious. But they're like, is Denmark Israel? Is Denmark Palestine? All this sort of thing.
Is Gertrude Palestine?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
So you just mentioned Mariam, and that was my next thing that I wanted to get to. A delightful character, beautifully drawn. I'm sure you had fun with her.
Yeah. She was almost the main character, actually.
Okay, that it kind of felt that way. Like, she's so vividly drawn and so dimensional, and has such a, I don't know if symbiotic is the word, but such a deep, like multi-leveled relationship with the Sonia character, in terms of her entrenchment in Israel, her privilege, maybe within the community of Palestinians. She's connected. She has a politician brother. I believe Wael is her nephew, right? Cousin. Okay, yeah. So she's got a pop star in the family. I mean, not the normal order of things usually. And she is very direct. She has a lovely bluntness that I love that. I think I love it in characters and in people, typically. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to deal with, but she's wonderful in that way. And she is running the show and making this thing happen against the odds. So I don't know. I just loved her. I loved the irrepressible nature of her. And I think one of the things that this book does in such a profound way is to draw parallels between political reform and theater, and like theatrical production. Like, both require, and you say as much in the book, they both require that people kind of participate in a shared delusion, which I think when it comes to issues around politics and national identity, it's easy to forget. Like, all of this stuff is made up. These are sort of agreements that we have with one another to participate in a shared dream. And the same is true of putting on a stage play of Hamlet, wherever it happens to be, or any play, right? And then you have the level of audience participation. Everybody's sort of buying in and suspending disbelief. And there's a section or a passage in the book where Sonia says, "Bit hard to fake a dream, no?" And Mariam says, "You have to fake it." And I think that gets to the heart of things, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm really happy that you like Mariam so much. She's really the reason that Sonia becomes part of the play, and why she stays so long in the country, because she's really drawn to Mariam. She's sort of she finds her abrasive, like you say, she's very blunt. But she also has this sense of mission, saying that you have to fake a dream. She has a sense of what she's striving for, and she's very clear about that. She doesn't have doubt, and that's very attractive to Sonia. So she's drawn to her charisma and into her orbit, even while Mariam has her own problems. She has issues with the family, and it's difficult to direct this play. Kind of cast almost entirely of men, and she's confronting all these other obstacles. But she's a sort of a fearless leader in this way, and that's very enchanting to Sonia. She's also a mother, and there's a way in which Sonia is drawn to that aspect of her as well. But yeah, I mean, that's interesting, that thing about collective delusion. I don't know if that's something I necessarily thought about, but I do think that there is a way in which commitment to a cause requires not quite faking a dream, but it's about managing to be at once pessimistic and optimistic. Or I think Gramsci says pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. You know, you
Right.
keep going even though it doesn't look like there's liberation on the horizon exactly.
How else do you possibly live in an environment like that unless you have, like, you have to have that? In the absence of that, what? Like, how
Right,
do you
exactly. Yeah.
how do you get through?
Yeah.
You know, and I think I can't help but measure myself against Sonia and Mariam. You know, I think I want to be more like Mariam, but I might be more like Sonia, more indecisive. Where do you fall on this spectrum?
I don't know. I mean, I think that inevitably when you write a novel, all the characters are some extrapolation of potential parts of yourself that you are trying to engage with or investigate. I think I'm not Mariam, but I think that being the maker of an art object, I feel like I mean, a novel, not a play. Obviously, I'm not. It's much easier to write a book on your own, where I get to stage the play, and that's really fun. But all my actors are made up, and I can make them do whatever I want.
Right.
So, so I probably most like her out of all of them in a way. Although I think I'm a bit nicer than Mariam.
Yeah, I think there's this school of thought that's like, you got to show up for your life, right? You got to go out there and get your hands dirty and do stuff and lean into it. And when you do that, like, fate might be more inclined to meet you halfway in a positive sense.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this thing where it's like, if you're not really into doing something, you shouldn't do it. You should only do things that you're really excited about doing. You shouldn't just do things to do things. I'm always struggling with the tension between those two impulses. Like telling myself, like, come on, Brad, just go for it. What the heck? And then also being like, I don't really want to. I don't want to show up halfway, So I feel like Mariam is somebody who just goes and has that sort of energy and that extroversion. And then somebody like Sonia might decline invitations on a more regular basis or something, or live inside that indecision.
Do you think that's also a distinction between maybe Mariam being a mother and Sonia not? Like, a mother doesn't really get the choice to be like, I don't feel like doing it today. It's like, you just have to do it. That's just like, and I think that's also something that's also in the mix though.
Yeah, maybe that's something. Like, I think maybe Sonia envies Mariam's lack of choice. Isn't it weird how human beings, we always envy what we don't have? It's like, God, I wish I just was completely bound to my responsibilities as a mother and had no personal agency at all. It would be so lovely. So let's talk about the title of your novel, which is drawn from Hamlet, and I think a stage direction when King Hamlet is commanding his son to seek justice. It's interesting to me, as you said earlier, that Hamlet came to you later in the process, because it seems so central to the book. Like, how late?
Okay, I mean, maybe not that late. I mean, like, before I started writing, but in the kind of conception period of the book, I was thought, maybe I'll do an Arabic play, maybe I'll write my own play. I kind of knew I wanted to do theatre before I knew I wanted to do Hamlet, basically. But the working title until the very end was something else, which was vetoed by all the people I work with. I knew it would be vetoed, but I was still attached to it for the time being.
What was it?
Go bid the soldiers shoot, which is the actual last line of the play. Everyone thinks it's then the rest is silence, right? Or that's the kind of, but it's in fact then Fortinbras is about to invade. The play really ends with this invasion scene, or kind of incipient invasion scene, and I thought that was kind of an interesting title. But
say it again. Go bid the soldiers.
Go bid the soldiers shoot.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that got next in favor of Enter Ghost.
In favor of Enter Ghost. I mean, I think Enter Ghost probably is a more saleable title in the end. So I agreed.
Okay. Well, yeah, I liked it, and I feel like, I mean, there's so many different resonances between the title and things that happen in the book, and I think it's a good choice. And Sonia plays in the play Gertrude.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who either have never read Hamlet or people who haven't read it in a long time, which describes me, so I was like brushing up on my Hamlet. Gertrude is
The mother of Hamlet.
the mother of Hamlet. And so why that role for Sonia? I mean, that seems like a deliberate choice.
I mean, Sonia is 38, so one of the things she's confronting in her career as an actor in London is that she's no longer the ingenue, and that possibly the window for hitting it big time in her field might be closing. That's not always the case, obviously, for actresses, but it is a consideration, right? So she's not playing Ophelia; she's playing the mother character. So that's one element there. Another element is that she's also confronting the specter of motherhood, the role of the mother in general. So not being a mother herself, she then plays one, and her relationship with Wael, who's the pop star playing Hamlet, becomes a kind of maternal relation as well. So there are these ghosts of motherhood as well. That are brought out by playing this role. Gertrude also is a very ambiguous character in the play. It's uncertain whether or not she knows what happened to her husband, and she's the victim of a lot of projection by Hamlet onto her. She doesn't actually say very much. So there's also some kind of interesting elements to the character itself there.
Yeah, and the relationship between Sonia and Wael, who plays, at least for a time, Hamlet, he refers to her as mother, doesn't he? He calls her mom in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way. So that's funny. He's a funny character in a lot of ways. He's like the one person in the cast who's truly got some fame, and he's kind of the star who's drawing a lot of the interest, right? Like to the play, but he's stressed. He doesn't want to do it in the end.
Yeah, I mean that's what's sweet about that. Mariam's ambition in a way to put on this very highbrow play, which is just not going to get a massive audience. But if she puts this famous pop star in the role, then she's going to draw a crowd. So she's caught in a kind of dilemma of artistic integrity in a way, where she has to turn the rehearsal rooms into a drama school for one of her actors.
It's like the Harry Styles of the West Bank, basically.
Basically. He's a little bit inspired by a singer called Mohammed Asaf, who won Arab Idol a long time ago and kind of shot to fame. Very beautiful voice.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Did he ever play?
He never played Hamlet. It's not Mohammed Asaf, but a little bit inspired by that trajectory to stardom.
Got it. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the logistics of putting this play on come to be central to the storyline of the book, going back and forth from, what is it? Is the territory called the 48? Or is it the people who live there? I forget the exact terminology you use, but kind of
48 is often how Palestinians will refer to that area. Yeah.
Okay, so but from Haifa,
it's generally known as Israel proper, in terms of, even though the borders haven't been declared. So yeah.
Right. So going back and forth from Haifa to the West Bank, essentially, for rehearsals, and I believe the play itself is to be staged in Bethlehem. Do I have that? Am I remembering that right?
Initially, yeah.
Initially, yeah, and like in the shadow of this wall, this divider wall, essentially. And I couldn't help but like shake my head and marvel at the same time as I was imagining having to go through all that just to put on a freaking Shakespeare play. Like it's an insane amount of logistical hurdles and weird pressures and dangers to have to endure to do something that should not be so difficult. And Miriam, who again is sort of like the heroine of the book to me, she says, if we let disaster stand in our way, we will never do anything. Every day here is a disaster. So like irrepressible and inspiring, but also really sad. Something like that, to have to, to say something like that and to have to grapple with that line.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can say Palestinians have a good sense of humor. I think it's very, there's a lot of this laughter continues in the face of disaster, and people still make things. People are still making art. People are still gathering. People are still doing things. People are still living, and that's something that I think always gives me succor. Going there. I haven't heard any stories in recent years of theatre plays in particular facing obstacles like the book's stages, I suppose. But there were some cases in the 70s and 80s where, you know, plays had to go through the military censor. Sometimes they were interrupted mid-scene by the army if they went off script. You know, there was this real sense in that period that that theatre could be kind of a powerful tool to rouse a crowd, you know, to get the masses to demonstrate or to awaken an audience to the conditions that they're living in. And I think there's something quite interesting about considering theatre having that kind of power, which I don't think really we have anymore. I think that era has passed. So it's also sort of evoking some nostalgia for the heyday of powerful political theatre.
Yeah, you know, I was going to get to this later, but now seems a good time based on what you just said. But there is something kind of anachronistic and wonderfully classic about your prose style and how lush and vivid and detailed it is. Like it has like I called it in my head anyway, kind of a 19th century vibe. Like you really, there's a lot of like really strong vision in this book. You really bring the place to life, and I don't know, just distinguishes itself. I don't see writing like this all that often. Am I barking up the wrong tree? Is this? Are your influences in any way along these lines? Do you have a love for kind of older fiction that works in this kind of mode?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I mean, I read widely and deeply, and you know, I read old books. I think that, you know, the 19th century novel or the early 20th century novel was more of an influence for my first book, and because this one is written in the first person, it allows me to. It became more slack and kind of vocal and more relaxed in a way, less focused on the sentence as a unit. I think I was quite focused on the sentence as a unit and what prose can do in terms of marking beats of time in a scene in my first book. And you could do different things with the first person. You can move through time and space more fluidly in quite interesting ways without it feeling, you know, confusing, I think, because it's all tied together with the eye. But I mean, yeah, I think there's always a hard question to answer. The question of influence. I think that you're influenced quite unconsciously, and I do love beautiful prose. So I suppose that I try to write beautifully to the best of my ability, because I think it's very important for vivacity, actually, for creating something that strikes the reader strongly, that allows them to see clearly, that allows them to remain in scene. And to feel in scene, the sort of intensity of the senses are something that I do focus on in my prose, I would say.
Well, yeah, and I think for a reader like myself, who's a Western reader, who doesn't have a ton of personal experience in this place, though I do have my very wonderful 4-day weekend in Israel to reflect on, where I went over for book research. And it was a lovely place. And I should say, too, something that your novel portrays very well is it's a tiny place, really. For as outsized of a role as it plays in the global imagination, Israel, you can drive around the whole country in 5 or 6 hours from one end to the next. And you're going from Haifa to the West Bank in a relatively short drive, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a relatively short drive. So these are very tiny distances, but they really matter a lot. You know, like a lot can change in a few kilometers in Israel.
And its significance is also profound in the region historically. Palestine in the Palestinian struggles also very important symbolically for other struggles around the world. And I think that so it does play this sort of outsized role, but it is definitely remarkable given how small the place is, that it's so that it, like you say, that it occupies such a large space. And that is also because of the massive role that America plays there. So it's very much in the American consciousness in its different incarnations, although quite specific incarnations. Yeah.
And I think, you know, we've touched on this a little bit, but another aspect of the ghost metaphor that carries throughout the book on all sorts of different levels has to do with Sonia and her family history. And I think kind of like in an immediate sense, her family is fractured. Both her parents have split up, but they also live all over the world. She lives in London. Her father lives in London. Her mother lives in, I believe, Marseille. And her sister lives in Haifa.
Mm-hmm.
So all of their shared time together is a kind of ghost, in her past. Mm-hmm. And then there is also the issue of family history and family secrets, which endure. And she's navigating those when she's on the ground in Israel during this summer that you cover in the book, where she's learning in bits and pieces about internal family conflict, about roles that family members played in the Palestinian resistance, about things that her own father had to endure, traumas that he endured, which he never really discussed with her. I got to say, I loved her father as a character too. There's something sort of lovely about your rendering of him. But there's also something tragic about him because he's carrying really deep trauma that he's never really shared with her and that has got to be so central to his identity. There's always something tragic to me when that happens between people who are so close, and who share such a strong family bond, obviously, that someone would carry that sort of thing around secretly, and that something that's so central to their identity would be unknown to their own child. You know what I'm saying?
Mm. I think it's actually quite common in Palestinian, that generation of Palestinians who leave, it's often then the next generation that want to go back, or there's a sense of wanting to assimilate into the West or to forget the past, a sense of overriding despair over a youth of commitment and activity. It's actually, something I was interested in depicting that. I like the father character as well.
Yeah. He's a good guy. Baba.
Yeah.
And then there's uncles and aunts that I guess had lived in Haifa and now live in the West Bank. Forgive me, I'm totally blanking on the name. I do this often with characters.
There's Nadia and Rima.
Say again?
Sisters. Nadia and Rima are the two sisters.
Okay.
Nadia,
yeah, but then isn't there an
Rima
uncle?
is married to Jad.
Jad, okay, he's the surgeon.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
He doesn't get on with the dad. They've got a kind of like unidentified conflict or kind of competition between them, a sort of patriarchal competition between the two men.
Right. And she goes to visit him. I liked him as well. And the aunt character. But interesting that someone would be living in the 48 and then like retire to the West Bank.
Mm.
Like that migratory pattern is sort of interesting. But I guess it happens, like maybe especially in certain generations.
Yeah. I mean, you do have, it's like it's sort of complicated in terms of documents, and there are people from Jerusalem, I suppose, who are worried about keeping their Jerusalem IDs, or there's certain, so they need to kind of keep a presence in Jerusalem, otherwise they put that status in danger. But people do move, Palestinians do move around. There's still strong connections between the communities living in these different geographies, and there is movement, even though those big signs when you enter the West Bank say this is illegal for Israeli citizens to enter here, but it obviously doesn't apply to the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, in a sense.
So you yourself are part of the Palestinian diaspora. You were raised in England, as was Sonia, so you share that in common.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how often, or if at all, you go back. Like, do you get to go back and visit? Do you have family there? Is this something that you're drawing on in this book? It seems likely, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I do try to go back. I try to go back once a year, more or less, and to kind of, I still have relatives there, and I have a lot of friends. So I feel connected to the place in that way, and it's important. It sort of plays an important role in my life, I suppose. But my family's from Nablus in the West Bank. Although I did have my grandfather was from Haifa as well, so I did have a kind of Haifa connection, I suppose. So a particular interest in that city.
Well, it's a lovely book. and there's a lot to it. Like, it's one of those books that is operating on many different levels, often simultaneously. It's, like I said, so super vividly drawn. And I love reading novels that take me out of the United States. So thank you. I'm very tired of being in the United States in some senses. So it's always a delightful departure, even if I'm taken to a place that has, a lot of challenges and difficulties and tragedies embedded into it. Like, it was a great education in that sense, though I know that was not your primary intention. It's also just a really beautifully told story. And it forced me to have to brush up on my Shakespeare, which is never a bad thing for somebody to have to do. Do you have any education? Like, I guess growing up in England, you obviously have Shakespeare education, but like formally at university or something, did you?
Yeah, you get sort of Shakespeare shoved down your throat. Although I think that, when I was at uni, because I studied literature, there was one paper in our final exams that was a Shakespeare paper, and I think I totally flopped that one. I found actually Shakespeare really hard to write about, and I ended up writing an essay that just counted the storms in Shakespeare plays in a panic in the exam room. So it's just a list of every storm that I could think of. It was a disaster.
I took a Shakespeare course in college too, and I mean, I was such a disinterested undergraduate student, like shamefully. I don't know. I was skimming everything.
Wasted on the young.
Yes, exactly. Precisely. So it's nice to revisit all that. And I always ask my guests if they are working on anything else. It's the cruel question at the end. You're celebrating the publication of this one, and I'm immediately asking you what else you have. But is there something in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel about two women, a Lebanese diplomat and an Indian photojournalist, who meet at a conference in Indonesia in the 50s. It's sort of about non-alignment and third worldism. Against the backdrop of non-alignment and third worldism is the relationship between these two women. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. It was an important conference that happened called the Bandung Conference. It was sort of part of the invention of the third world as an idea. That was a project.
Oh, so what is non-alignment? Yeah. Forgive me for not knowing.
Non-alignment is, so in the period of the Cold War, the non-aligned countries were those which wanted to have nothing to do with either power bloc of the Soviet Union or the USA.
Oh.
So they wanted to, they saw non-alignment as a sort of central way of maintaining world peace. And in fact, they played a pretty important role in nuclear disarmament. So it is, even though the history of this particular conference and some of these diplomatic struggles isn't sort of mainstream in the West, I would say, they were actually played a massive role in the course of global history. So I'm kind of interested in looking at, and a lot of them are coming out of anti-colonial struggles as well. But of course, it's a story about two women. So this is the sort of backdrop that's infusing their relationship.
Well, I can't help but note that you are again working at least somewhat from historical source material. Like you were, the Parisian was very much dealing with history, and I imagine had you doing a lot of research. Obviously, with Enter Ghost, you have to dig into Palestinian history and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its history. And now you're going back to this. What was the name of the conference again?
It's called the Bandung Conference, or the Asia-Africa Conference, actually it was called, but it's popularly known as the Bandung Conference.
So is this where you typically start? Like, will there be some sort of historical event that you build a narrative out of, or something like that catches your imagination?
I don't know. I guess I'm just really, I'm kind of nerdy, and I get excited by history. And there's so much that hasn't been explored. There's so much history that doesn't get properly recorded, or either it's not archived, or it's in the archive, but it doesn't get mainstream, or it's sort of niche, or there's so much to learn. And it comes from a learning impulse, I suppose. Maybe it also comes from a fear of the present. I don't know, or a sense that I can understand the present if I go back, or, but it definitely is an impulse in me. Maybe I like to make writing novels kind of scholarly in a way, or maybe I like it to be something other than simply making scenes and drama, for there to be also some kind of engagement with that historical predicament.
Yeah, I mean, there's like automatic stakes, right? Like this is what I always envy when I read like really explicitly historical fiction is that like, wow, the stakes are just there. And also the narrative is there, the shape of the narrative, at least. It obviously has to be filled in by the writer, but a lot of times you can find a structure to a narrative, maybe not in a one-for-one way, but it can be extracted from historical circumstances or can fuel the construction of it. So I guess like I'm secretly always curious about writers' strategies for how they make their books.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's prefab plots. If you go to history, you've got some prefab plots, so that's another good thing.
It is, but like you say, it's vital work because there are all these narratives like left in the dustbin of history, many of which are very vital and instructive and fascinating that nobody touches or knows about. And so kudos to you for finding them and kind of breathing life into them in this way, because for somebody like me, you know, it provides me with entree. It reminds me of how little I know, which is never a bad thing. So I wish you well on it. I thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're here in the States on tour and running around. So many thanks for carving out some time to talk with me. Congratulations on Enter Ghost, and best of luck to you with all that you have going.
Thank you so much for having me.